Hi, welcome to Vibration Cinema, the altered destiny of film. Today, we are going to try to do the impossible, decolonize the camera. This is a very cumbersome topic, no doubt, but it isn't as complicated as people make it out to be. It's bulky because we're looking at history, politics, archives, aesthetics, technology, and so forth. Generally speaking, academics have a tendency to think up new ways to look at and understand the archive of colonial photography. The London College of Communication has a lecture series called Decolonizing the Lens, which gives you an idea of how this works. While this is an important part of the conversation, it only analyzes the past at the point of reception. Many artists focus on contemporary aesthetics at the point of production. Our channel series, Eyes and Teeth, details some of the short-sightedness of how artists engage in these questions. If you know my line on lighting black skin, you know what I'm talking about. This work also devolves into corny shit like this, which centers white culture by literally painting it black. Some thinkers don't engage with the camera per se, but the violent language of shooting, capturing, taking, etc. This is a matter of semantics that doesn't really address what happens when the shutter is released. For example, if I blow your brains out, it doesn't really matter if I pulled the trigger or blew a kiss. We're also at the point where this topic is being liberalized, as evidenced by Vogue hosting a Decolonizing the Camera talkback. Now, I love some of the Wintour covers. What the fuck does she know about colonization? I want to use this episode as a way to streamline this conversation to make it less convoluted.
The war in Congo has many layers to it, and the reasons have evolved over time. The reason at play today is the heavy deposit of mineral resources, particularly cobalt. Congo produces around 70% of the world's cobalt. Cobalt has become a significant mineral that is said to be the key to the future, and everyone wants it. The US, Britain, France, Israel, and many other countries continue to finance rebel groups to destabilize Congo so that cobalt could be extracted at a cheap price and also easily smuggled out of the country. The Congolese people have become slaves in their own country, controlled by rebel groups to manually extract cobalt for sale in the black market. Most of the cobalt that is exported by Rwanda is actually smuggled illegally from Congo through the help of the M23. The discovery of cobalt has made Congo one of the wealthiest nations in the world, but making its people the poorest in the world. Cobalt is used mainly for lithium-ion batteries for smartphones, tablets, laptops, electric vehicles, jet engines, medical scanners, and many other devices. In the course of this war in Congo, 6 million people have been killed and 7 million people have been displaced. But guess what? The entire world is silent about this matter.
The most pressing step to decolonizing the camera is stopping the over-extraction of rare earth minerals necessary to produce most cameras today, which not only damages the environment but requires the super-exploitation of miners. In order to decolonize the camera as a physical object, your starting point has to be anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. However, though this is our defining struggle as photographers and filmmakers, it should be obvious that this struggle is of no importance to, for example, the liberation of Congolese people. A free Congo is of primary importance. Linked in the description are organizations that are doing aid work in Congo, like Focus Congo and Free DR Congo.
My name is Joy. This is the Focus Congo team behind me. We just got back from the area that got bombed yesterday. It was actually 10 bombs. It was over 40 casualties, and we don't even know how many injuries there are. There's absolutely no information, so I don't expect you to have all of the exact details, but I do want to correct you and let you know it's not 12 deaths, it is over 40 and counting. And the casualties, we don't even have those figures yet. We don't even know where they are. There are children without mothers and fathers now. People have lost their homes. This is probably one of the worst cases that we've seen here in Goma, and it's getting worse every single day. So just thought I'd update you from people who are currently on the ground working in the displacement camps. Thank you for talking about it. Love you. Bye.
At the same time, though, the camera is being used and has historically been used by Palestinians in their national liberation struggle. So these more aesthetic and historical political issues pertaining to decolonizing the camera are still relevant. Again, even though the camera is not and can never be the engine for liberation.
To ask myself, is there something fundamentally undecolonizable about the apparatus? If you think about the role that photography played in a very instrumental sense in the colonial project itself. So, for example, in order to map terrain and understand the nature of terrain so that one could then command it, photography was a major tool in that. You think about some of the things that you alluded to yourself, Mark, the construction of others, predominantly around race, but also around gender, in order that one might then dominate subaltern populations and this kind of thing. The way in which photography is then also implicated in regimes of surveillance. And so I began to ask the question, can one decolonize the camera as an apparatus? And then I began to think about what you do in your book, which is actually not to engage so much with the apparatus of photography as something itself that can be decolonized, but to develop practices of reading that allow the decolonization to take place at the moment of reception, not within the moment of production through the apparatus.
How do we make sense of the fact, as decolonial scholars would have you believe, that taking a photo of an indigenous person is an inherent act of colonial violence, while at the same time recognizing that photographers like Alex Gardner deliberately did not take photos of indigenous people out west to create the narrative that the land was empty? Or how do we contend with how Edward S. Curtis perpetuates the same idea by actually photographing the so-called vanishing race? Here we have a Gordian knot situation. Taking photos of indigenous people is colonial, and not taking photos of indigenous people is colonial. How can this be? The way the conversation about decolonizing has developed over the past 2.5 decades, cannot provide an answer, which to me points to its uselessness, but the question remains. How do we cut through this knot like the Grecian twink did centuries ago? I think the answer is really simple. The real problem is that we've defined the camera by how colonizers use it. We've replaced a noun with a verb, and a verb that privileges the oppressing class. Indigenous people have never ceded legitimacy to colonizers. We see this clearly when Palestinians used a caterpillar bulldozer to break through the colonial border imprisoning Gaza, and with Hamas appropriating failed Israeli missiles.
By any means necessary.
Asks us to look at the utility of a tactic or a tool, not at who invented it. So all of this confusion is cleared up by starting from the point of indigenous sovereignty. Colonizers privatize water and use water as a part of ethnic cleansing campaigns. Indigenous people say, Nini Wachoni. Colonizers will weaponize anything and everything. Rejecting the premise of the colonizer's political program is the first step in decolonization. When you start from the colonizer's perspective, your analysis is always going to reproduce the very colonial logics that you seek to overcome. I don't know a single indigenous struggle that thinks that colonizers are undefeatable. But when we color the ontology of the camera with how colonizers use it, we essentialize the camera as a colonialism printer. In that way, on some imperceptible level, a photograph is ipso facto always already metaphysically colonial. There's no way to overcome the nature of the photograph as such. So we end up shadowboxing an enemy really of our own invention and not the actual material enemy. This is an anti-indigenous stance. Colonizers are the ones who purport themselves to be unbeatable. Our position starts with the understanding that it is only a matter of time before the colonizers' defeat.
تقدري له انت لشرون؟
بقدر له ليش لا؟
ما هو أكبر منك بدك تقدري له.
أنا أكبر منه بإرادتي. بقدر عليه بإرادتي، بقدر عليه إني بدي أدافع عن وطني، بقدر عليه إنه قتل يعني ناس بعرفهم وبعرفهم معرفة، يعني معرفة. بقدر عليه لأنه شتتنا. خلى كل واحد بجهة يعني معاهم سلاح ومعاهم دبابات يبقوا يتزروكوا بين الدبابات خايفين منا إحنا يعني مدنيين بس هم إرادتهم ضعيفة خوفهم لدرجة الجنون سنعيش صقورا شامخين ونموت أسودا واقفين وهاي كل واحد إسرائيلي يحفظها ويعرف شو معناها.
Another insidious way decolonizing the camera reinscribes colonial logic is by giving so much air to the history of colonizers that it inadvertently ends up erasing the history of how indigenous people have used the camera. Dr. Celeste Pedri-Spade, an Anishikabwe visual anthropologist, opens her essay, The Use of Photography and Decolonial Praxis, with, quote, "The majority of anthropological literature around photography of indigenous peoples has privileged the actions, agency, and intent of the Western photographer. While one cannot ignore the significant colonizing influences that photographs have had on indigenous peoples, one cannot presume that these individuals were solely the silenced subject or victims in a one-sided inferior relationship with the camera and its operator. Recent scholarship is now re-examining the relationship indigenous people have had with photography as a culturally productive technology since its development. This research has drawn attention to the agency and experiences of colonized people in global contexts as producers, subjects, and viewers of archival and contemporary vernacular and artistic photography," end quote. This sentiment parallels my classic rant. It's a failure of decolonizing the camera that more people know the ahistorical take that celluloid is racist than they do that 4 years after the camera's invention, some 20 years before emancipation, free men and former slaves used the camera as part of abolition movement, not just as photographers like Augustus Washington and James Presley Ball, but also subjects like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. This information has been around since about 1985 publicly, originally published in Deborah Willis's bibliography celebrating the first 100 years of of black photography from 1840 to 1940. Palestinian cinema is mostly talked about in the post-67 era, despite the fact that Palestinian cinema predates Israel by 13 years. The pre-Nakba films were destroyed, and Israel had laws prohibiting Palestinian cultural production, so this is to be expected. But we nevertheless have to do a better job of pushing the longevity of indigenous people's use of the camera. When we fail to demonstrate the breadth and depth of indigenous photography in cinema, we erase over a century's worth of contributions by indigenous people and fail to recognize how the contemporary moment is still mired by colonialism. And to this last point, for me, this is exemplified by Nita Satam's statement in a 2018 interview with Bright magazine. Quote, "Photography was the privilege of Western inventors, experimenters, and anthropologists. With the advent of affordable cameras, photography has finally begun to democratize and decolonize." End quote. Jenny Ross Cobb of the Cherokee Nation took up photography in 1896, taking photos of her family and friends. Benjamin Haldane, a Tsimshian photographer, opened a studio in 1899 where he took portraits of his own people. Importantly, he would photograph them in traditional regalia, which was illegal at the time. In 1905, the Cree photographer Richard Drossel worked with the people of the Crow Reservation who refused to be photographed by non-natives. And as far as I know, the earliest indigenous film, or at least the earliest one that we have available to us, in North America is The Falling Arrow from 1909. These are a few early examples from just one continent. I can't cover the global history of indigenous photographers, which dates back into the 1880s in New Zealand, in any meaningful capacity, but you can check out some readings in the description, including the seminal book, Our People, Our Land, Our Image, International Indigenous Photographers. And though there aren't digital copies, I highly recommend hunting down Visual Currencies, Reflections on Native Photography, African photographer J.A. Green, Reimagining the Indigenous in the Colonial, and Fragile Legacies, the photographs of Solomon Oseji Alonge. The history runs deep, so it seems rather silly to say that the camera is just now beginning to decolonize, considering that abolitionists were using it as early as the colonizers were, and the 40 or so year gap between the invention of the camera and when indigenous people pick it up will only get increasingly insignificant with the forward march of time. But at no point in this interview with Bright Magazine did anybody involved mention that the contemporary accessibility of the camera requires the super exploitation of land and people, which is a good opportunity for us to bring back the conversation to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Let's take some time to look at the history of photography in Congo. I want to start with Dr. Mark Seeley's 2019 book, Decolonizing the Camera, Photography in Racial Times, because it exemplifies what I mean when I say that exclusive analysis of colonizers erases the history of indigenous photography, particularly in this instance when it comes to Congolese photography. 4 out of the 6 chapters of his book are dedicated to individual white colonial photographers working in colonial situations. 1 focuses on the cohort of Life magazine photographers who documented the liberation of Buchenwald, and the last chapter, the only chapter to explore people of color as photographers, is about how Black British photographers and a handful of African photographers like Seydou Keita had to navigate British cultural institutions in the 1980s. I mean, so off bat, we're already kind of, on the shit with this book. But what's irksome here is that there are 2 chapters dedicated to Congo. Alice Seeley Harris's work in the Free Congo State in the 1880s and 90s, documenting the atrocities of the Belgian colonizer King Leopold II, and Robert Lebec's work at the time of Congolese independence from Belgium in 1965. No mention of Congolese photographers, which is interesting because 18 years earlier than the publication of Seeley's book, Revue Noire published Photo Kinshasa, a history of the capital city through photography from 1870 to 2000. Photo Kinshasa documents all kinds of photographers working in the city, including colonizers, as well as photographers from other African nations, and shockingly, Congolese photographers as well. In 1957, the colonial photographic agency Congo Press, a subset of the Center of Information and Documentation for Belgian Congo and Rwanda-Urundi, hired its first Congolese photographer, Joseph Makula. Makula had worked as a military photographer for Force Publique, the Belgian colonial army, before joining this agency. Congo Press was a propaganda effort to show the civilizing effects of colonialism, urban development, free expression of religion and culture, etc. and so forth. Makula took over Congo Press after independence, which was brought under the control of Lumumba's government. Makula would replace the European photographers who originally made up the staff with Congolese photographers whom he would train, including the only female photographer of the agency, Patti Sudia. Unfortunately, I couldn't track down much information on her. But here we have a Congolese photographer who embodies the contradiction at the heart of this conversation, employing the camera to serve both the colonizers and the new independent government. The history of Congo Press also demonstrates that old colonial apparatuses can be molded to work for the independent nation after liberation, a phenomenon one might perchance call decolonization. Jumping back in time to 1884 when Alice Seeley Harris was working, Hezekiah Andrew Shanu from Lagos in modern-day Nigeria moved to Boma, the capital of the Free Congo state, to work for the Leopold regime. Later in life, he would become an anti-Leopold informant. He used his camera in service to the colonial government and his later anti-Leopold politics. So he too embodies the contradiction at the heart of this conversation, that the camera can be used as a tool of colonialism and as a tool against it. If you're attempting to work through this mess that decolonizing entails, I think that these men present a much more compromised and therefore more fruitful example than some twee British lady, but I guess Dr. Seeley doesn't feel the same. Throughout the history of Congolese photography, you'll find a lot of Angolan photographers. Antoine Freitas, Gracia Manunki, Marquise Ndaudo, Jean de Para, John Domingo, Emmanuel Santos, Ambrose Gaigmoko, and photo studios like Photo Sardane and Vind Photo. Angolans were fleeing Portuguese violence, and their status as foreigners in Belgian Congo allowed them privileges that Congolese natives were left out of. So they were actually able to open photo studios. Again, there's a lot of threads to follow and unpack here. What does it mean that people fleeing their own colonial situation become central figures as photographers in this colonial situation? How did Congolese people engage with Angolan photographers? How did the Angolan photographers treat the Congolese people? An Angolan photographer working in Kinshasa, Emmanuel Diojos, his main clientele, for example, were Angolans in Congo and natives who assimilated into the colonial government called Ivoles. So if you're going to analyze just one photographer's work and its relationship to colonialism, why not work through the class aspirations at play in Diojos' practice, especially his Congolese clientele, which legitimized the colonial state? Even though individual Congolese photographers like Timothée Gandavi started as early as 1925, it's in the 1960s, the decade of independence, that Congolese photographers emerge en masse with photographers like Lima Pive, Thomas Lucchini, Nduka, and studios such as Photo Gentil, Photo Bedos, Photo Makoba, and Studio Nguma. It's weird to me to talk about some German photographer documenting Congolese independence, as Dr. Seeley does, when, in a sense, Congolese photography in the hands of Congolese people really emerge with independence, a historical development that strikes me as quite relevant to this conversation of decolonizing the camera that we're having. A lot of these older studios that started in the 60s closed in the 90s, either because of the lootings or the economic depression. So we can see this almost as the end of an era in Congolese photography. But Congolese photography, of course, lives on with family photos and the work of Arlette Bashizi, Pamela Tuzuli, and the late Kirby Katembo. Even though this is a completely inadequate history of Congolese photography and Photo Kinshasa, my main source of information, is really just a primer, I hope I at least demonstrated that the practice, history, and politics of Congolese photography are relevant to decolonizing the camera without centering white European photographers. Gaza is one of, if not the most surveilled places in the world, and baby's first introduction to surveillance is usually French sex pest Michel Foucault's analysis of the panopticon. The panopticon is a circular prison in which a guard tower sits at the center. A guard can see what's going on in the cells, though he obviously cannot see everything simultaneously. But because the prisoners know there is a non-0% chance the guard is surveilling them, they begin to act as if they are being watched, even if they are not. In Discipline and Punishment, Fool's Cult uses the panopticon as a metaphor for the machinations of repressive technologies. Obviously, the world is not built like a literal circle prison, but I'm sure we are all familiar with the ubiquity of CCTV cameras and how the government tracks social media posts. When we think of surveillance in Gaza in the lead up to October 2023, we must remember that the Netanyahu regime knew about Operation Al-Aqsa Flood for about a year, and that the week leading up, both Egyptian and US intelligences warned of potential Hamas activity. So we have multiple surveillance apparatuses being ignored by the Israelis. To me, this speaks to colonial hubris, which is being brought to heel by the resistance as we speak. What does the panopticon mean in the context of the last year and a half if the guard knows the prisoners are planning on escaping unless it happened anyway? But that's not even what's really interesting. The United Front has completely changed how we understand the power dynamic at play in the panopticon. It's not just the guard who is surveilling the prisoners, but the prisoners who are also surveilling the guard. And the key difference here is that the guard does not know which prisoners have built a Hamas tunnel into his station. The guard knows he's being watched, doesn't know by whom or from from where, and he's under threat of actually being taken out at any time. The Qassam brigades are popping up whack-a-mole style in Israeli encampments across Gaza to just film IDF soldiers, casually observing them for reconnaissance before taking action. And for a disturbing amount of time, like, these people have no peripherals, no sixth sense, like, just heads empty. And this is creating stress among the Israeli ranks. So in this context, Hamas is literally using the camera as a tool of psychological warfare against the colonizers in a decolonial movement. The Israeli soldiers' genocidal freak nature compels them to take photos of their conquest and post their crimes to social media platforms. Hamas is using these posts to track Israeli movements. Surveillance has been one of the key ways Israel has exerted control over Gazans, for example, by blackmailing queer Palestinians into becoming informants. But now, the United Front is using those same surveillance tactics against the colonizers. Hamas is also filming their operations taking out Israeli tanks and drones and soldiers for a couple of reasons. One, this further inverts the panopticon and is meant to demoralize the Israelis, who have no idea that they can be taken out and no idea when they can be taken out, as we've discussed previously. Like, Hamas is using backup cameras on cars to coordinate detonations. Like, this is crazy. Hamas has shown us that surveillance is not just the tyranny of the colonizers, but a weapon of liberation. Importantly, though, filming these humiliations demonstrates that Israel is indeed a paper tiger, that the colonial entity can be slain. These videos are not just to scare the colonizers, but to keep the flame of hope alive for Palestinians. With the incursion into Rafah, we're seeing these videos more frequently again. And we should also mention that the Ansar Allah filming their successes in the Red Sea are also a manifestations of this dual phenomenon as well. Hezbollah has also been using videos. You'll notice the cut in this particular one. As John Elmer notes, Hezbollah is showing Israel that it has the capabilities of taking out its military equipment, but will not show Israel its own military capabilities, hence cutting out whichever missile it is that took it out, just only showing the hit. Abu Ubaidah has started addressing Palestinian allies in the West, which means Hamas is tracking the engagement and reach of their videos and shifting tactics accordingly. We are seeing in real time the creation of a new cinema. Hamas has been compared to the Vietnamese for its implementation of guerrilla warfare, and Hamas is credited with adding another dimension to guerrilla warfare, which is the use of a complex system of tunnels below ground.
They're under a building, so they're below ground. They're climbing up the tunnel to the main floor, and then they're climbing the stairs in order to get an elevated firing position. You'll see the warhead flying through the air from the elevated position on this one. There it is there. Green for the good guys. So what you have is a three-dimensional attack here. Fighters who are down under the ground protected, coming up to the first floor to the surface level and passing on the surface level because it's more militarily effective to fire on an elevated firing position.
But there are also innovations for us who are studying the camera to take note of. The Vietnamese also filmed their operations, but to my understanding, it was primarily for training purposes and for archival purposes. The new dimension that Hamas has added to the videography of guerrilla operations is to employ those videos in real time against a colonial entity, something that was not possible for the Vietnamese to do using analog technology. I'm not a military expert, so I highly recommend checking out John Elmer's work for Electronic Intifada, where he analyzes these videos. Sana Saeed has a thread contrasting the IDF's use of propaganda with Hamas's, and of course, Warfare Analysis posts the videos that the United Front produces. These Hamas and United Front videos are the clearest examples which demonstrate the inadequacy of starting the conversation of decolonizing with the ontology of the camera, especially since the ontology is wrongfully understood as inherently colonial. When you start from the perspective of how indigenous people use the camera, you can see the evolution of operational videography from Vietnam to Palestine. You can examine the visual rhetoric of the glitches in Hamas videos, GoPro cinematography, the Al-Qassam Brigade's military choir music videos and their use, analyzing the timing and frequency of when Hamas drops videos, how these videos have evolved over the course of just 7 months, and how red triangles became a symbol of armed colonial struggle. I grew up in clan country. I'm sorry, but white people bad is not an insight. Did you know that white people use the camera for racism? Like,
boring, yawning, sloppy, lazy.
how indigenous people use the camera is just so much more interesting. When Gordon Parks said that he uses the camera as a weapon, he mostly meant in a cultural sense, on the battlefield of ideas. Hamas is literally using the camera as a weapon on an active battlefield. And it only works as a weapon because they've been able to broadcast those videos on WhatsApp and other social media platforms. So in a very real sense, the revolution is in fact being televised, except when it is not, like in Sudan.
So a frequent comment that I'm getting on my posts is like people asking why they haven't been hearing as much about Sudan, why they haven't been finding articles on it in the media, they're not finding creators that are talking about it. Overall, just a lack of coverage on the fact of the matter, right? This is due to a variety of reasons, but one of the most detrimental reasons because of for this is the fact that the RSF literally just anyone that records what they are doing, they will unalive any person they see recording or if they find out that you've been documenting and spreading bad things about them on social media, if they find you, they will you. Another reason that we have to stay aware of is the fact that the oppressed groups in Sudan right now, I mean, Sudan as a whole is a part of oppressed groups that are not cared about in Western media. Black, African, Muslim, they do not care. Like, they never cared about those groups of people. So that's a major factor for that as well. Another reason for it is because a lot of the news that does come out of Sudan is in Arabic, and if it doesn't get translated to English, it will never reach us because it's news that's created for Arabic speakers, and if Arabic speakers don't push that news and don't translate it, which is what a lot of Sudanese creators are trying to do right now, it will not be reached. It will not reach the target audience. However, there's a few sources that I'm going to share with you guys if you want to keep updated. Firstly, I recommend Nas Al Sudan on Instagram. You can't really see the username, but it's just the name, just no spaces in between. Nas Al Sudan on Instagram. The Sudan page on Instagram, once again, you can't see the username, but it's just the Sudan page with no spaces in between. This account on Twitter, this is a girl that is my age that is living through the war in Sudan and documenting on it. So I just find this one's a lot more personal. It's less like article based, and it's just literally a person who is living through this right now. And then lastly, SudanWarMonitor.com. This is like more news based. Some articles are translated into English, not all of them, but majority of them are translated into English. They update almost daily with news, so these are what I find most helpful for me at the time being.
Palestine teaches us that the camera is a weapon of liberation, a galvanizing force. Relatedly, South Africa teaches us that images can have evidentiary benefits in another aspect of decolonial movement international law. Regardless of how inept we think the ICJ is, the point is that Palestinian liberation is a multi-front endeavor to build enough pressure so that the colonial entity cracks, and the camera is deployed in many of these fronts. At the top of this episode, I argued that decolonizing the camera isn't important in the context of what can actually decolonize the camera, which is a free Congo. The DRC teaches us that the camera is marginal, that ironically centering the camera and decolonizing the camera misses the point of decolonization. And we know the push for digital was a scam to fill Facebook's pocket, and we know that not only affected how people engage with information, but also the detrimental effects it's had on journalism. In addition to what Dr. Hamdan said, we need to realize that this phenomenon is at play in the silencing of Sudanese news. The very things that are beneficial to the Palestinian cause are detriments to the Sudanese. This is another danger that contemporary discourse over decolonizing the camera presents. In speaking metaphysically and ontologically, one might as well be speaking in broad generalizations. When we do that, we ignore how different colonial situations require different tactics and strategies. We ignore what's happening on the ground. It's why By Any Means Necessary is a more useful analytic. It requires us to look at what's happening and to act accordingly. Even through this silencing, Sudanese photojournalists are still working. Ala Kier, founder of the Sudanese Photographer Group, has taken photos of the crisis. And it's important to recognize that power is porous, not totalizing. Things will always slip through the cracks. This is why we even have information about Sudan in the first place. Colonial situations are always in flux, and access to a camera therefore follows suit. As Sudanese photographer Gadala Gubara calls it,
I am the only cameraman, black cameraman, hold the camera in his hand in Africa. The first one. Because the Sudan was the first independent country.
An important statement from the person who photographed the Sudanese flag being raised the day of independence on the 1st of January 1956. Recently, the works of Ibrahim Shaddad has been restored. He, along with other Sudanese filmmakers, have been in the process of restoring and archiving Sudanese cinema. But to be honest, I really couldn't find much about Sudanese film and photography, but I am curious to learn more. I saw Shaddad's film in quarantine and recommend seeking them out on Solidarity Cinema. But again, more importantly, free Sudan. I cut a lot from this video, and I thought in the aftermath of the M23 bombing and the incursion into Rafah, it'd be more appropriate to focus on the DRC and Palestine. And now a resistance is developing in New Caledonia who are using the camera as well.
The French, Viva Palestine, up the IRA.
So I guess we should start a new channel series that we'll call Film and Social Change, a name referencing the cornerstone course of the LA Rebellion, where we will examine the historical and contemporary uses of the camera and resistance and liberation movements. Our history of Palestinian cinema and AIDS video activism episodes will be added as part of this series. Like, comment, share, subscribe, but more importantly, go into the description and donate to the organizations that I've listed to help the people in Goma and Al-Fashir and Gaza. With that, love you all madly. See you on the next one.